Lesson 3 is on ancient Egyptian geography. So we did our geography notes. It was coloring and labeling a map about ancient Egypt. And we also talked about hieroglyphics a little bit and a crash course on Egypt and the CNN 10. So the I Can today was I can describe two major features of Egypt's geography. So at first we talked about where Egypt is in northeastern Africa. Right there, you can see kind of the Nile River even from this distance. So we talked about how the Nile River snakes its way up through the top of Africa there. And we talked about how just how sandy and deserty the Middle East and North Africa is. As viewable from this kind of globe view, it's very deserty up there, so it's sand, it's desert. But around the Nile River, it's super green. When you look at it from space, you can't even see the blue of the river because the river's not that wide, but there's so much agriculture taking place on the banks of the river as the Egyptians, even in modern times, use the Nile River for irrigation to grow crops. The Nile shows up on satellite photos as just green. We also talked about the delta up there at the top. When the Nile River gets up to the top of Egypt and it's going to spill into the Mediterranean Sea, it kind of slows down and fans out really wide into a river delta, and it's an excellent place for agriculture, both in ancient times and now. Very easy to grow food along the Nile. So Egypt's two geographical features, one of them is just desert. Egypt is an absolute desert, as you can see from this picture. And the other is the Nile River. If you get away from the Nile River, you're in absolute desert. And if not, you're right on the banks of the Nile, and it's fertile area to grow, and you can irrigate crops. Here you can see the Nile, the world's longest river, snaking up from Central Africa all the way and dumping into the Mediterranean Sea. We also talked about the Nile River flood cycle. So the Nile River starts up in Lake Victoria, kind of in Central Africa, way up in the mountains, in the rainforest jungles of Africa. And as the monsoon rains roll through the jungle, it pours a lot of rain. And that rain works its way down the Nile. And for a few months every year, the Nile River experiences massive flooding. And it overflows its banks, and it flows over all the farmlands. And the farmers can't farm. But then when the Nile River floods go down, it leaves behind new silt. And that soil that it puts on top of the farmlands is like dirt and soil from the African rainforest. So it's fantastic growing conditions for the food. As a matter of fact, the ancient Egyptians had it so good, they could grow 2 crop cycles a year. So they could plant crops, get them all the way up to maturity, and get the fruits and vegetables off their crops, and then do a second cycle every year. So we had a blank map, and the first thing we did is to draw and label the Nile River coming up from the bottom and spilling into the top of the Mediterranean Sea where there's the Nile River Delta. And we labeled the top Lower Egypt and the bottom Upper Egypt, which may be confusing and upside down, but in ancient Egyptian times, they called the bottom of this map here Upper Egypt because it was upriver, it's upstream, and also uphill. Elevation-wise. So if you were moving down the river, you would also be moving into Lower Egypt. We also labeled the other bodies of water around Egypt, the Mediterranean Sea on top, the Red Sea to the side, and then right where the Nile starts to fan out into its delta, we have Cairo and Giza, the pyramids of Giza, where the Great Pyramid is and the other massive pyramids. About halfway down where there's kind of that bend in the river, we have the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes and also Karnak, which is a huge outdoor Egyptian temple complex that was built up by many pharaohs over hundreds of years. And then heading farther down on the map, we get to Abu Simbel, which is a large temple built by Pharaoh Ramses. It has 4 big statues of Ramses outside that are over 70 feet tall. And, Egypt is famous for having all this gold, but there actually isn't any naturally occurring gold in Egypt. All of it came from other kingdoms farther south from Egypt, such as Nubia. And as the traders were coming up the river to come into Egypt and trade with Egypt, Abu Simbel was built way down there as a way to just intimidate people who were coming in, like, you are now entering Egyptian space and territory, and look how massive we can be. Look how monumental we are and how organized and powerful we are. That our culture is capable of producing these massive temple structures. It was just a way to kind of strike awe and fear into the people that were just coming into Egypt along the Nile and crossing over the border on the southern side. So that is Abu Simbel. We also talked about how when they dammed the Nile River, that it was going to create a new man-made lake that would flood the original location of Abu Simbel. So we talked a lot in class about how it was moved to a higher elevation, block by block. They cut it up and moved all the pieces, and how they had to kind of build a fake mountainside to put it into. So a pretty cool place. And then up at the top, we talked about the city of Memphis, that throughout ancient times, the capital of Egypt was moved again and again. And then we drew some palm trees and a little oasis and a camel in there, because why not? Once you get away from the river, the Nile River, it's just desert out there. So we drew those in there as well. I can name 2 geographical features of ancient Egypt. The 2 geographical features were deserts and the Nile River.